So a podcast is a lot of things, and I suppose the big question is, what do you want it to be? On a practical level, it exists to entertain. But on another level, I like to think about Three Castles Burning as an archive of voices from Dublin at a moment in time. And listening back over its 5 years and a bit, there have been some important discussions, standing in the foyer of a fire station, the country on the cusp of a pandemic, talking to Willie Birmingham Jr. about his dad, or chatting to Peg McManus about her activism over many decades. And similarly, this week's edition of the podcast has the feeling of being very important. Podcasts are generally recorded. Well, I'm recording a podcast anyway. It's sometimes on a park bench or on a Zoom call or in front of an audience. This one was recorded in someone's home. Gayle Cullen is not only a resident of Oliver Bond House, she is a voice for those who live there, a community activist and driving force of the Oliver Bond residents group. And she's very much at the heart of her community. When I walked into Oliver Bond, which is one of the largest of the Herbert Simms housing schemes, the very name Gayle alone was enough for neighbours to point you in the right direction. And when I got there, waiting for me was Eoin O'Broin, author of Flats and Cottages, Herbert Simms and the Housing of Dublin's Working Class, 1932 to 48. I love this book. I love it enough to critique its subtitle, because this book does not limit its focus to 1948. And what Owen has done brilliantly is he centred the people for whom the Dublin of Herbert Simms is not some architectural curiosity, but a lived reality. And residents, activists and communities trusted Owen and photographer Mal McCann to tell the story of the places they call home. I did an edition of the podcast before with Owen down at Electric Picnic, and this book was kind of taking shape in his head at the time. And that was a broader talk about public housing historically. What I thought was great about this one was when I got onto him, he immediately said, well, let's get a resident on as well. And Gayle came to mind. When I think of Herbert Simms, I think of Ellen Rowley, architectural historian, cycling around Dublin on her bike, a short documentary by the late and much missed Paddy Cahill. And that was just magic viewing. I think it was 2012. And for many people online then, I think it woke us up to the beauty of Simms' work and his legacy. And, for many people, I think that was a big moment when it came to Simms. Eddie Conroy, whose brilliant thesis on Simms, well-thumbed thesis, everyone's gone to look at it, is surely the foundation block on which anything else will be built, was another champion of Simms. But broadly speaking, I think there's a reason Herbert Simms resonates with people today. And against the backdrop of what seems like a never-ending housing crisis, there's something about him and that time that offers great hope. Back in 1938, the novelist and the activist James T. Farrell was in Dublin visiting his friend James Larkin, and he would write about that visit. He was interested in housing. He drove me about and showed me the new houses that were being built in the slums of Dublin. I had wandered the streets of those slums fairly frequently during my stays in Dublin, and I'd visited some of those rotting old houses, and I talked with those who lived in them. They were beaten and cowed people. Jim spoke at length of the new houses, of his hopes that they would do some good. He showed me various ones which were in the process of being built. He knew that these would not at all be adequate, but he was very proud of them. And pride is something that really does come true in this story. So from Gayle's home in Oliver Bond, I bring you this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I'm very proud of this edition. Thank you so much to all listeners of the podcast, in particular, those who supported or have supported it on Patreon. There are still one or two episodes to go this year. And while it wasn't the busiest year in terms of the number of episodes, I think the quality was really, really strong. And I'm very proud of this one near the end. So enjoy. Many of the blocks of flats constructed in Herbert Simms' time as housing architect carry the names of nationalist heroes, from Emmett Buildings to Markievicz House. And at Bridgefoot Street and Usher Street, we meet Oliver Bond. Oliver Bond, full name Oliver Cromwell Bond. For more on that, go back to the edition with Fergus Whelan exploring the United Irishman, was a leading light of the Society of United Irishmen in Dublin, and a man who did more than one stint in the Newgate prison, the place where he would die in mysterious circumstances for the cause in which he believed. You enter Oliver Bond House through its arches, giving you an immediate sense of the enormity of this project compared to the earlier Herbert Simms sites. Before getting into Herbert Simms himself, the names that are most immediately recallable here, for people, of course, are more familiar than Bond or Simms. For Gayle, Oliver Bond is not just her home, it is central to the story of her family.
Okay, so my family moved in here when they were built in 1936. I think these blocks were built 2 or 3 years after the other 13 blocks. So RS&T were probably built in 1938 or 9, I think. And then that's when my great granny would have moved in. And then me granny, and then me mother, and then me, and then my son was also born in the home that my mother still lives in since Oliver Bond opened.
This complex, like Chancery House, Pierce House, St. Michan's House, and others, is part of the landscape of what I call affectionately Simms City. There is also, as we'll get into later, Simms Suburbia, but it's important to have some sense of Herbert Simms himself. It's not surprising, as I mentioned in the introduction, that Simms is back in focus in the contemporary city, but it is surprising that he ever faded from view. And that seems like a good place to start. Who is he and why did he, in some ways, fade?
He's a working class Englishman, grows up in Kilburn, fights in serves in the First World War. We understand he may have suffered post-traumatic stress from that experience. Comes back after and gets an opportunity to go to college because of his role in the war. He gets a scholarship and he chooses to go to Liverpool to study architecture and planning. One of his professors there is Abercrombie, the very famous English planner who had at various stages from 1922 onwards been commissioned in Dublin to design city regeneration plans, many plans which were, of course, never built at all. But Abercrombie, because he has a connection with Dublin, is Simms's entry point into the city. He works in private practice with the brother of the then Dublin city architect, O'Rourke, then moves into Dublin City or Dublin Corporation as a temporary architect. And after a brief period in India, comes back, applies in 1931 for the city architect's job and gets it in 1932. After that, we know very little about him. We know lots about what he did. We know about his trips to London, Manchester, Liverpool, Amsterdam, Vienna. We have his beautiful photographs. We have the reports he wrote for committee. We have his testimony, as you quote in one of your own books at various public hearings. But we know very little about him. What was he like? What was his character? What, was his home life like? And I talk a lot about the book, about an interview with Eddie Conroy, who wrote his wonderful master's thesis in Simms. Eddie kind of makes 3 points about why so little is known about him. Because he, of course, ultimately took his own life by suicide in 1948. There was a stigma that surrounded him, and people who knew him didn't want to talk about him, even all those years later when Eddie was doing his research in the 90s. Simms's style was early modernism, almost kind of expressionist, and that had fallen out of favour by the 60s, 70s and 80s, so people kind of just thought he was an anachronism, kind of old-fashioned.
But what does that mean, that his work had gone out of style? In other words, I wanted Eoin to explain what makes these buildings unique and what sets them apart from not so much what came before them, what came after them.
The best way to think about it is the architectural style that dominated architectural practices in the 60s, 70s, 80s is RTA, right? It's big, modernist, concrete buildings that I find very attractive, but most people would find a bit more difficult. I think these buildings are beautiful. They have beautiful brickwork. They have beautiful archways. They have beautiful balconies. They have, they're from an earlier stage. They're not the big, bold, post-Second World War kind of modernist, brutalist edifices, which I also think are very attractive. These are still very human. They're only 4 stories. You have a street where you get to talk to your neighbours on the balcony. But that was very unfashionable. And then the other thing that Simms did is he drove large-scale public housing. And it goes back to the point I made at the start. We shouldn't be afraid to say that a place like Oliver Bond can again be an absolutely brilliant place to live. It is a brilliant place, right? All of the work that Gayle and people here in the community do as youth workers, Wes, Gayle's partner in the Ushers Celtic, people in this community, and this is important to say for folks who don't live here, the overwhelming majority of people in this community are hard-working, contributing members of society and Oliver Bond, and they bring their kids up to be the very best models of citizens. But the problems in this area can be resolved, and Oliver Bond can be even better, right? But again, in the 1980s, 90s, and noughties, this had become unfashionable. Large-scale public housing, large-scale housing projects for working people to live in. So I think because of all of those things, it was almost like people had just forgotten about Simms. And therefore, I think it is really useful in more recent years that people have spoken about his architecture a lot, his buildings a lot. But I suppose, for me, the centre point of the book that myself and Mal did was to say, ultimately, these places have to be about Gayle and Jeanette, Gayle's mother, and the sons and the community. And therefore, yes, we can appreciate the architecture, right? But if the buildings are cold and damp and badly maintained, the architecture doesn't matter a damn. The good news is, we know we can have these homes fixed to completely modern standards and retain the beautiful architectural features that are there. And when I spoke to folks for the book, when people were asked, almost to a person, if all the problems in this community could be fixed, if the homes could be made modern and warm and clean, if community safety could be re-established, would you live anywhere else? Pretty much everybody said, no, fix the problems and we want to stay here. People who talked about, like in the interview that I had, Gayle, about the challenges of living here, the challenges aren't the community, the challenges aren't the people, the challenges aren't even the building as it was originally built. It's the failure of the state to maintain, to listen, to involve, to tackle the problems that are there.
And while people are a little romantic about Simms' work today, it's perhaps Chancery House and Chancery Park, which the Lewis goes by, that comes to mind. The bigger schemes like Oliver Bond's, may not. When he spoke before a housing inquiry in 1939, he was adamant that housing of the working classes would have to be accepted sooner or later as a permanent service like water or any other municipal services. When questioned on the lifespan of flats at that same inquiry, he argued flats, if properly maintained and not abused, should last 200 years. But the ones that we've lost already often were the larger blocks, the larger projects. And people sometimes say, well, they failed because they were too big. But Eoin is keen to emphasise that when it comes to scale, he doesn't think it's straightforward.
Two observations. The first is, when any of the Simms schemes we developed in either the flat complexes or the suburban cottages, there wasn't any money for facilities or amenities. So most of the blocks didn't have any facilities in them. There were battles over whether they should even have the pram sheds and the washing lines. It was only over time that some of them started to have, for example, like Mary Aikenhead House, one of the shops in the front. Killarney Court, what was Joseph's Mansions, has community facilities in, and as we learnt in the discussion in Henrietta Street from one of the former residents there, it had a dentist and a paediatric centre at one point, right? So there simply wasn't the funding to provide the kind of social amenities that comparable schemes in England, the Netherlands or Vienna would have had, because in those other schemes, the schools would have been located in here, the creches would have been located in here, the medical facilities, they would have had playgrounds. Some of these blocks now have playgrounds, but they didn't have originally. So that just wasn't a feature. And Simms himself, when he did his study trip to Vienna, and he writes his detailed written report back, he makes it very clear the conditions aren't the same. What I'd also say, though, is I don't agree with like the likes of Eddie Conroy, the former South Dublin architect, who says that the size of these schemes was in and of itself a problem. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, Gayle's observation is completely correct. This isn't just one community. Like, it's the same in any large social housing project. If you go to any of our large estates, you'll always get subdivisions within that, depending on the phase people moved in or whatever. But also, you go to Killarney Court, and Killarney Court is a small Simms block. In the 1990s, that was, so I'm told by the people who lived there, the most difficult block in the city. The guards simply physically could not go into it. Organised drug crime and heroin had taken such a control that it was an incredibly dangerous block, right? And that's a small scheme. Now, you could argue because of the design of that scheme, it was easier for people to, in inverted commas, take control of it. So, the bigger schemes have other challenges. Eddie Conroy makes the case about Oliver Bond that it's not just the scale, but as Gayle outlined, the fact that it's on this kind of sloping tier made challenges. I think what that ignores is, if you talk to folks who grew up here, they talk about how, whatever the challenges, these were really, really strong communities. And it was only at the point of the 80s where the industrialization, large-scale unemployment, the arrival of, in particular, heroin and the impact of heroin and organised drug crime, and then the refusal of the state to step in and work with the local community to address those issues. I think if the state had done its job properly back in the 80s, we wouldn't even be having a conversation about size. Sheriff Street wouldn't have been knocked down. Teresa's Gardens wouldn't have been knocked down. So I'm nervous about this idea of scale being the problem. That's not to say that there aren't challenges, right? But those challenges exist in other blocks as well. Like Chancery House is an unusual one because it's very, very small. But go and talk to the folks in Emmet Buildings, right? They'll talk to you about the challenges that the bond has at the moment. So I think scale means that there are different responses that are needed, but the scale didn't create the heroin epidemic. The scale didn't create the unemployment epidemic. And the scale wasn't responsible for the state washing its hands of this community and leaving the community to its own devices to fend with all of the issues that Gayle talked about and grew up with here as well.
For Gayle, growing up here, there was a sense, that this was an enormous place to live, an enormous scheme, but it felt almost like there were several Oliver bonds within it, what she terms communities, I should say, within communities.
And even though like there's 16 blocks of flats, there was also always been a few communities within the community. So like Air blocks would be known as the Hat and Coat department. And around the far blocks, C, D, E and F block, there was a fish shop on the outside of Oliver Bond, and that was called Fishmongrel's Walk, was named around there. And then the three high blocks, L, M and N, they were up a steps. There used to be a castle steps before the other steps were put in. So they were like up a height. And then that's where, when there was only hash back then, that's where the hash was sold. So we used to call that Columbian Heights because that's where the hash was back in the day. So they all had little communities. So if I left my blocks and went around to the other blocks and was causing grief, I'd say, go back around to your own blocks, go on back around the Hat and Coat department.
Now, one thing Simms did have and the corporation more broadly had was a sense of community. If you take the nearby Watling Street flats, now known as Emmet Buildings, the first residents to move in there largely came from nearby Marrowbone Lane, another street which would witness a Simms block in time. And that was kind of reflective of the favoured policy of the day, as I wrote in the Three Castles Burning book, which was decanting. Essentially what that meant was that, tenants were temporarily moved from tenements, blocks of new flats built, and then the evacuated tenement livers rehoused in the new flats. So there was a sense that community predated the buildings and should be maintained.
The working class communities that had been living in the tenement blocks that pre-existed these blocks had been here for generations. And therefore, these weren't new communities. These were communities that were steeped generation after generation after generation. And sure, as people from the countryside moved into the city, they absorbed some of those. And therefore, these were existing communities. Now, in fairness to Dublin Corporation, not just Simms, but the housing manager at the time and the underpinning legislation, they recognised for a variety of reasons that preference had to be given to inner city flat complexes rather than suburban cottages. So when the housing plan was agreed after Simms became the housing architect, for every one suburban cottage, there should be two inner urban flats. And part of that was just very practical, which is most of the folks who lived where we're sitting today back in the 1920s were casual labourers. They were men and women who worked very difficult and really low paid jobs. The men worked in the docks. They worked in some of the factories. They worked in construction as unskilled labourers in many cases. The women, when they weren't working at home, worked in shirt factories, in matchstick factories, in street trading, in fruit markets. So if you were to move to the suburbs, the only transport to get to your place of work was the tram. The tram was private and it was expensive. So some of it was just a recognition that people needed to be close to where they worked. Some of it, and Simms was an advocate of this, was also recognition that this is people's home, this is their place. We need to facilitate them, not just by allowing them to stay here, but as families were moved in from tenements into the new flats, they were moved in the same order. So if the Cullen family was here and the Murphys had been upstairs in the tenement, the Murphys got to be upstairs in here. Where the ideology comes in is as follows. there was very, very strong views from people who were perceived as planning experts. Then, as now, a lot of our influences came from across the world in England. And Abercrombie, Unwin, Geddes were kind of key figures in the emerging kind of planning movement. And they all favoured the idea of the kind of garden suburb, that if you broke up the kind of squalid, overcrowded, teeming, disease-ridden, crime-ridden inner city communities and move people out to the fresh air and the green fields of the suburbs, people would live different kind of lives. And some of that was a Victorian reaction to the squalor that people were living in, but some of it also was a middle class kind of patronising attitude, blaming inner city working class communities for the problems which they were living with, but which they, in my view, didn't create.
I put it to Owen that it strikes me as peculiar how we remember opposition to flats and the promotion of the suburban ideal. We think about the church and priests advocating for these new suburbs. But when you go back and look at the contemporary newspapers, there's actually a much broader series of factors that were pushing for suburban houses and not flats in town. Housing campaigners on the left, including Jim Larkin Jr., son of the man we heard mention of in the introduction, they were adamant that suburbs were of much greater value than flats. My own great-grandmother called the first corporation flat scheme, Ellis Court and Ben Burb Street, beautifully regenerated in recent times, home. But it and the early corporation flats that followed it had largely failed in the eyes of some.
Flats had a bad history here. One of the reasons why, exactly as you mentioned, Ben Burb Street and Ellis Court, the really early public housing schemes in Dublin by the corporation were what's called model tenements. They were 4-storey, or in the case of the Ivy Flats, 5-storey Victorian buildings where you got 2 rooms to live in rather than 1. And families didn't like them. They still were kind of dark internal staircases, no communal courtyards, very, very small. So those schemes were also very unsuccessful. So to be fair to the likes of young Jim Larkin and them, I suspect the antipathy towards flats was their understanding of flats were those unsuccessful so-called model tenants. And then the church, right? The church took a view, some of them more extreme, that any kind of communal living was a bad thing. Right? The Jesuit priest McGrath, writing in Studies in the early 30s, talks about, the moral danger of the common stairwell, and was pointing to the fact that the cities in Europe that had lots of good quality public housing were also the cities in which social democrats and communists and dangerous radicals were on the rise. There was also another problem. Flats are more expensive to build. Right? The land has a higher premium. This is a big challenge for us today as it was then. So one of the reasons why there's so little building inside the urban core of Dublin today, and all the building is happening where I represent out on the other side of the M50, is it is cheaper to build out there. So there's lots and lots of things. And I think what's important for us today is not to oversimplify it, right? But what is invariably true is, and this is my own family's experience as it is Gayle's family's experience, the majority of people wanted to stay here. So again, I talk about my great-grandmother, Rosanna Wheeler, and when she married John Hughes, they both lived in the tenements in St. Augustine Street. They then were one of the first tenants to move into here, to the Oliver Bond flats, as it's called now, but it was the Bridgefoot Street flats, as its original name. And they were then offered an allocation out to Crumlin. I don't know the street, and they moved out to Crumlin. And I talked to my nana a lot before she died, and she said, it was really far away. It was really expensive to come in. You didn't have your neighbours. You didn't have your friends. It was too quiet, right? It was a wonderful idea. So they swapped the flat and they moved back into Oliver Bond. And after my nana was born, they were then given an allocation into Dolphin Road, right, which is a little bit closer to the city, just on the canal there in Drimnagh. But I remember talking to my grandfather, and he really struggled with it. He was from the tenements in York Street. And there was that sense in which people, now they took the offer, they weren't being forced, but they felt they were being displaced from their place. Having said that, they eventually settled there. My father grew up in Dolphin Road along with his siblings. And those were really good places. So for some people, that worked. For other people, it didn't. But the problem was that 2-to-1 ratio of 2 flats to 1 cottage was never adhered to. It was flipped on its head, and it was 2 cottages for every flat. And therefore, a lot of people didn't necessarily get the choice, or as their children were born, because the flats here were full, they didn't get the chance to stay where they wanted to, and they had to move elsewhere.
Life in Oliver Bond hasn't always been easy. Gayle reflected back on many of the challenges of the past, the community would mobilise itself in a big way, as did all the larger Simms schemes in the days of the anti-drugs movement and the Concerned Parents Against Drugs. And looking back retrospectively, she, I think like many people who lived through that time now, recognise that was a very imperfect movement, at times misdirected, and hopefully something someday we can properly get into on the podcast. But one net positive of that time was that communities, when they protest together, they come to learn the ropes of organising more broadly. And that in some ways was a key nucleus in campaigning on amenities and other things in all the years that have followed.
I can remember that was back in the 90s. I think we were actually only starting to go through the forced regeneration in here. But yeah, I do remember people going out and you were just going up and throwing people out of homes for selling drugs. And we thought that was the right thing to do at that right time. And it did work at that time. But it's only when you educate yourself more and you realise that it's not really the answer. But if the state is not doing their job, who else is to, So that something needs to change in the system. Our systems are broke. All our systems, the majority of our systems are broke. It needs changing. So people don't have to take the law into their own hands. But definitely more organised and I'd say more educated, where nobody knew what to do. It was kind of like the way the coronavirus came, everyone went into panic. So I'd say that's what happened back then. Everyone panicked. What do we do? If the guards are not doing it, we'll take it into our own hands.
Gayle spoke about how her own relatives were moved out, for example, to Ballyfermot, but how they always very much remained Oliver Bond people. And the identification with the city centre itself is so interesting. To get from Sim City to Sim suburbs, Eoin was adamant that there's real architectural value also in the homes that were built in places like Cabra and Crumlin. But I put it to Eoin that maybe we don't think of them as part of Sim's legacy because, the flats remain in town, they are still public housing, they are still housing Dublin's working class people. The houses in suburbia often went private.
Before I answer that, one thing I will say is during the course of researching the book, one of the things I realised was actually the architecture of those housing schemes is as interesting as the architecture of these flat complexes. Obviously, it was very different in the sense that they were much more mass-produced and they were more standardised. But all of those housing schemes have really beautiful little modern features and very beautiful little design features. The problem is we just take those things for granted, right? So people just, like Wendy, the copy editor from Merrion Press, when she was coming back to me after reading the edit, she was saying, I see why the architecture of the flats is important. The houses in Crumlin Cabra are just ordinary, right? Well, actually, they're not ordinary, and at the time they were very different, right? And I think we should re-celebrate and kind of evaluate that. I suppose there are two reasons. Look, first of all, particularly in the 80s, but even before that, obviously council tenants were given the opportunity to buy their homes, and that was very important in that it allowed people to control their homes in a way that us renters don't get to control. Like ultimately, if you're a tenant, you have to go and ask people for permission to do stuff to what is your home. But also, people were very keen on tenant purchase because it would guarantee their children and grandchildren would have a home after they were gone. So when people moved to buy their council homes, they couldn't buy the flats, of course. It was from very, very good reasons. And in many cases, we still have the fifth generation of the family living in those homes. In the book, we interview Shane Mallon and his family, his grandfather, his father, him, his daughter, and even for a short period of time, his grandson have all lived in that home, which of course, when he and his wife took the tenancy, they bought. And he talks about the importance of having this place that you could always return to. The difficulty is when people then wanted to sell the properties on, and they were allowed to sell the properties into the private sector. And invariably, landlords would buy those properties and landlords would rent them out, and then eventually they would sell them. Crumlin now, you'd be looking at 550,000. Cabra, particularly close to Stoneybat, are 550 to 600,000. And that's in recognition of how good the houses are and the proximity to the city centre. So some people say it was the tenant purchase scheme that was the problem. I disagree. I think it was not allowing people to buy the homes, control the homes, pass them on to their kids, because they're all really important things. Right? It was when people came to sell them, there should have always been a clause in the original purchase agreement that you can't sell them to the private sector. You have to sell it back to the council at the discounted price you paid for it, indexing inflation, and the home is kept kind of public. Because what people who don't live in council estates don't understand in my opinion, the people who are against tenant purchase is what we call intergenerational security of tenure, or having generation after generation after generation live in a place is really important because it creates a really strong community. It creates a really strong sense of place. And we should never lose the importance of that. And if tenant purchase creates that, and it does, particularly in a lot of our suburban housing estates, then I think we should keep that, but we should never allow the property to be sold at the private market. If it's for you and your family for generations to come, great. But at the point of sale, it's sold back to the council. I think if that had been done, those communities would be very different places today. Having said that, you still have, in all parts of Crumlin Cabra, lots of council tenants. You have tenant purchasers who then, or their kids or their grandkids, have remained in the properties. And interestingly, in some of the places like East Cabra, the fact that properties are in the market and people are moving or buying in, that is in some cases having positive benefits to those communities as well, in the sense that it's bringing back a little bit of income mix and employment mix. So for me, the challenge isn't tenant purchase, it's sale into the private sector, which is a separate issue. And a very simple fix to that is change the rules of the scheme legislation. The only small point I'll also make, not affecting here, but in the 1980s, the government introduced this appalling scheme where they actually incentivise people to sell their council houses, to give up their council houses to buy private homes. People got a deposit of £5,000. And particularly in West Tala, in Finglas and in Darndale, what it meant is anybody with a decent job left those estates, got their £5,000, went and bought a house, and the economic base of those communities contracted terribly. And some of the problems that we subsequently had in those neighbourhoods in the 80s and 90s were as a consequence of that what's called surrender grant. The lesson of that is, when government introduce new initiatives, ask yourselves, what's the long-term consequences for the community, for the people? Because if your focus is always the long-term consequences for the community, you'll make better decisions. Whereas back then, what government was trying to do was free up council homes for people on the list, but didn't want to spend the money to buy the houses. So they gave better off working class families the £5,000. They'd get out and they'd free up the homes. Great short-term policy, I'm sure, for whoever thought of it in the Custom House. Very bad long-term policy for the community itself. And we're still dealing with the consequence in those three parts of our suburban housing estates today.
And of course, the elephant in the room is COVID. Oliver Bond went viral, so to speak. And the other way things go viral in a pandemic, with a rave in its grounds by, let's be honest, we're very bored young people. And young people right across the city of Dublin reached the point where they weren't behaving in the best way. But before going to Eoin on how the architecture of the Simms flats proved productive to communities in pandemic times, I first asked Gayle about her memories of that time.
Everybody came together, then even when you were allowed back out, or we done community things, cleaning the playground while staying away from each other. And then in the middle of it, we actually done a mask challenge with the Arts Department of Dublin City Council, where we delivered masks and coloured in paper colours, and they had to make their own mask. And we had 100 kids signed up for it. And then we also had Dublin City Council paid for my first Holy Cova, and they came out to the block and done a play, and everyone came out onto the balconies and were able to look over. So it did bring back that lovely sense of community. And then as we were kind of opening back up and coming back through, then stuff started happening in the flats, and then it just has been out of control since, in regards to, like, I know there was a big riot happened on the pitch, and the Taoiseach came out said he'll do this and this, hasn't done a single thing. And then after that, then all the other anti-social stuff and crime start happening,
Yeah, and there is a connection, whether people understand it or not, between the architecture and allowing the community to do the things Gayle did. Like the COVID bingo was such a wonderful example. And the eldest person we interviewed for the book, Kathleen Delamere, she was 96 years old in 2022 when we interviewed her, and sadly she passed away 2 years later. But she would have been living on her own in her flat when COVID hit. And if you think it was scary for the rest of us, for an elderly woman on her own, not able to have the family come in the way they had before. But the design of those flats lent themselves, and of these flats lent themselves, just as Gayle said, to that you could have everybody sat out, socially distanced, on their balcony, in their chair. There could be a bit of theatre, there could be the bingo, there could be a bit of crack. They also lent themselves to people in the community being able to stop and do the messages and the shopping, and in a way that a modern block with no balconies, as some people are currently advocating for, and just with internal stairwells and dark corridors, wouldn't have been possible. And I think that was very deliberate. The courtyards, the deck access, the ability of people to be able to watch the kids when playing, that was all part of the design. And sure, COVID or Simms didn't know about pandemics or whatever else, but they did know about TB, right? And people forget this. Like, one of the reasons why you have balconies, one of the reasons why you have certain designs, even if you look at the schools that would have been built in the 30s and 40s, they had different ventilations, was people back then were very acutely aware of the impact of airborne diseases and its impact on communities. And I think there's a lesson in that for today. So we have some people saying, oh, yeah, we're going to build a lot of flats, but nobody will have a balcony because balconies are too expensive. A balcony is not a luxury, right? Particularly in an inner urban area where there isn't a lot of public open space and you don't have your own gardens, right? Like one thing, I can't remember if it was Bernard Shepherd out in O'Reilly House said, is that he would have liked to have a private balcony during COVID where he could have gone out, like I was able to go out in the back garden of the place we rent in Clondalkin and just have a bit of privacy, right? Because the deck access has a double-edged sword. You get to hang out with your neighbours. But if you're not getting on with the neighbour down the corridor, or in O'Reilly House, one guy has partitioned off his bit of the deck access, right? And to get to one group of flats, you have to go to this bit of corridor or deck access that he's now claimed, and he's not very happy if strangers he doesn't know walk through. So I think some of the Simms blocks, Mary Aikenhead House, has some private balconies as well, which I kind of like. Yeah. The regen plans they were discussing at one point for O'Reilly was to give them some private balconies looking out onto the Dodder and the Liffey. I think that would be a beautiful idea. So I do think those design things are important and not accidental.
Simms recognised the need to provide for the needs of communities beyond bricks and mortar. I mean, he told one inquiry that you cannot rehouse a population of 15,000 people, as in the Crumlin scheme, without providing for the other necessities and amenities of life. I mentioned football to Gayle. This is the land of Usher Celtic, of course, a team with which her husband is involved, an area that is steeped in Dublin's football traditions. The best footballer I've ever had the privilege of watching in the League of Ireland, Chris Forrester, gets an unexpected mention around here. But in her own time managing schoolboys, she had Chris Forrester under her wings, but she mentions the poor facilities for the football team are one significant negative of the area.
I know Chris Forrester I would have managed him. I keep claiming this fame. I managed him in schoolboy for a few years, and I remember I only brought my son to a match there, and he came over to me and he says, Gayle, I still remember you telling me you're going to play for Ireland when you're older. And I said, well, there you are, you're in the League of Ireland. It's just as good, But even like that, even my husband's team, Usher Celtic, they've got to big major finals, played against Boas and Pats, and sometimes have to give up the home advantage because there's nowhere to play. And then if they do get the money to play in the Grange Gorman, there's loads of clubs make money on the gate. You can't make money on the gate, so they'll lose them. They have a pitch up in Ireland Bridge, but it's constantly off because it's grass. It's not, and then there's no floodlights. So even though there's a space up there that could also be used as a pitch, and if you built 5 pitches here, they'd be constantly booked and used, because I feel from youth work years, every Monday night we used to have football up in St. Catherine's Sports Hall at 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, and we'd 100 kids every Monday night consistently for 10 to 12 years. And it's a big driver in reducing young lads. Now, a lot of girls didn't get involved, but they came to watch the boys. But that was still an involvement. That's where you built your relationships. But today, now the girls are creeping up on the boys in the sports, which is brilliant. And it's important that we invest in sporting facilities and community centres. I'm literally only had to come on from Ringsend, Irishtown Community Centre, and I'm sitting where there's a cafe, and they're just coming in, and I actually said, I'm actually very jealous. Like I'm very disappointed that you have this and we don't. So we need investment. We need somewhere we can drop in. We had that small little hut around there. My dad would have been in there for a few years, voluntary, just people on drugs dropping in, and it turned into an addiction service. If we had an addiction service back, we could target people in addiction. We could target people in crime, So they need to bring it back into the community and make sure there are opportunities that's multi-purpose. that we have from cradle to the grave, and that we can help everybody.
Not since Ronan Sheehan and Brendan Walsh put out that beautiful book In the Heart of the City in the 1980s have I seen a writer and a photographer work as well together as Eoin O'Broin and Mal McCann have in this book. And Mal is from Belfast, but Eoin felt that his own background made him the perfect photographer for this job, and he really did capture some extraordinary moments.
Yeah, so first of all, just to acknowledge, it's a really big deal for Gayle and Gayle's mother, Jeanette, to allow two complete strangers into their home with a big camera, with a big lens, right? And like, okay, I have contacts in the community, and we were able to kind of go to people, so they had some sense that I wasn't a complete head to ball, and that, you know, we'd respect that. Like, Matt and I were very clear when we came into people's homes, the deal was different to when I interviewed architects or architectural historians. They got a veto. So when we wrote the chapters and put the photographs in, if the families didn't like them, they could have stuff removed, right? So that was the kind of the deal. And for me, that's very important. When I interviewed Eddie Conroy or Ellen Rowley, or I got to write that whatever way I wanted. And I think what I really like about Mal's photography is twofold. Most architecture books don't have any people in them, right? They're just buildings, and that's okay. But buildings are for people, right? So the idea that you could have buildings without people. But also Mal has picked up loads of lovely little things. Like, I think there is a photograph in this section on Oliver Bond where there's just a little young lad with his nose just above the balcony, right, that Mal just caught. There's another really lovely one, and I think it's Emmett Buildings. This young lad notices Mal and just sticks his head out the window and sticks his tongue out at him, right? There's the two women talking in the balcony, one with a bunch of flowers. So it's not just that he does the portraits beautifully. I really, really like the portraits of the folks we interviewed. He catches all these other moments. You know, that image of the really ugly Hummer pink limousine passing by Markovich house is perfect. That could be going in for somebody's confirmation or Debs or whatever, right? It's perfect. The beautiful photograph Mal got on Watling Street outside Emmett Buildings of the young lad driving the horse and the four carriages standing up going through. So I think he photographs the buildings in their honesty, the graffiti, the rough sleepers, the wear and tear, right? I think those portraits are beautiful. I think he makes people look really good, but I think he captures the lived moments. You know, another one I really like is when we were in St. Mickens, and because it was a group interview, there was loads of banter and crack.
Yeah.
It was really good fun.
Yeah.
But then he takes this photograph of a woman in her pajamas hanging up the washroom, right? That's the community life here. That's, I think, and it's her good pajamas. It's her outdoor pajamas, right? They're really, really well. She probably ironed them before she put them on, right? But that's the life here. And I think he captures all of that stuff really brilliantly. And I think it's also partly, he's a working class lad from Belfast, self-trained photographer, worked from, you know, working with me in the Republican News in the 90s, then in the Andy Town News, then in the Irish News as a junior photographer then. But for him, it's about the community. It's about the people. And Mal doesn't say a lot. He's a very, very quiet fella. He really enjoyed those sessions because while he was taking the photographs, he was listening to the history and historians. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of differences, but a lot of similarities between where he grew up in Belfast and the challenges of communities there and here. So I just think he's brilliant. And I keep telling him we've at least another 2 of these books to go. So
yeah,
so there's this space.
You know, great photographs. And I mean, Ma didn't get to get hers yet because she's only in a hospital. But I was just explaining to her, you have me, Ma's. That's the flat there, that's in the family years. But over in the corner, there's my flat. You can actually still see it. So over my shoulder is my flat, and we're standing at my Ma's flat.
Brilliant.
So these Herbert Simms flats, are they fit for purpose? I remember many years ago, maybe 20, 22 years of age, standing outside Emmett Buildings, giving a little potted history, and a woman shouting out the windows, that's all well and good, you don't fucking have to live in them. But as the geographer, Ruth McManus, she's made the point that, look, even in the 1930s, there was a sense that these dwellings were small. Herbert Simms himself, McManus believes, would have been quick to acknowledge the need to provide residents with updated facilities. Retrofitting to modern standards, although expensive, can provide for these needs while appropriately respecting our architectural heritage And that's been proven across the city time and time again. You can bring public housing up to the standards we need it at. While these flats have their problems, for the people who call them home, they largely do wish to remain there, and they are deeply proud of coming from there. Regeneration is a word floating around once more, but as Gayle points out, the community still see Oliver Bond as central to their own lives and future.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like even today, like when we're talking about the regeneration, my ma said there's no way she's moving. Like, so well, not only going to have a trouble trying to get the regen, it's trying to get me ma out. She said, over her dead body, will she move? So it was just kind of like generation built into you. This is your home, and it's go to nobody else. Like even my mad would say, we have to put one of your kids' name down on my floor so this flat doesn't go anywhere. You know what I mean? So it was generational that you don't let your home go. This is your place. This is your home. Yeah. So there was no. I know a few family members did go to Ballyferma and other places, but in my ma's immediate family, no, it was Oliver Bont is all she ever knew. All they all ever knew.